G'day bird nerds, g'day gardeners. I'm Grant. I'm a horticulturist, also a bird nerd. This is Habitat Gardening Saturday morning here in the state of Victoria, Australia, Naarm, unceded Wurundjeri country. Today, I'm for only the second time so far in Habitat Gardening. We've got a live guest, so let me introduce Brian Borncamp. How are you, Brian?
Good. I'm good. Yeah, good to be here.
Happy Thanksgiving. We have to say that, don't we? You being a native New Yorker, is that right?
Yep, that is correct. Yep.
Okay. Now, folks, you might be wondering why has Grant brought on this guy from New York onto the show? That's because Brian runs a nursery called Zuba Plants, and Brian has I think, a sort of similar journey to me in that you get into plants, you get into having a little nursery, having a lot of fun, and then you think, hey, wow, these plants can actually do something and they can do stuff to improve the environment. So rather than speak for Brian, Brian, Zuba Plants.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, I can talk a bit about that. So, yeah, a few years ago, so I've been a gardener for a really long time. Maybe, well, I don't know, since I was but maybe about 18 years or so now, and kind of first started off just doing a lot of fruits and vegetables and things I could eat, but then started doing more landscape plants and flowering plants. And a few years ago, decided to try and start a very small sort of commercial backyard nursery, and tried selling and growing a bunch of different things, but eventually landed on a lot of the native species, native to kind of the contiguous 48 United States, and particularly stuff in my part of the country. And I think I kind of fell on that for a few reasons. So one, a lot of it was just the stuff that I like to grow, right? And also it's nice to have like pretty flowers, but also it's great to bring in birds and butterflies and other sorts of insects, right? And I think the other thing too is with a lot of the plants that we grow, at least some of the more native species, the deep-rooted perennials, they store a lot of carbon, especially compared to say something like turf or just regular old grass lawn. And so that was kind of how, and then also I just found that there was an increasing demand for it. So a lot of the local sort of major chain type home improvement stores don't always carry sort of the native species or the stuff that's best for the wildlife. So it was kind
Oh,
of this.
come on, you're being very kind there when you say they don't always carry. They just don't, do they?
Yeah.
Because they don't fit into uh, the massive streamlined production chains. I mean,
Yeah.
I used to work in a production nursery that sent out the mixed dozens to the supermarkets and to the big box hardware stores and whatnot. And that if we were lucky, there would be. Well, I can think when we did the climbers, there was not one native plant.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
when the uh, then when they did their sort of hedging plants or streetscape kind of plants that would go out, there might be 3 out of 12 would be
Mhm.
a native, and certainly not indigenous to the
Right.
region where they were going. Let me ask you something, because you said it's getting more popular
Yeah.
now, the idea of planting natives. Did the consumer demand that you were able to fulfill
Mhm.
in your little nursery, did
Mhm.
that drive you more to being interested in habitat gardening, or was you having the options for people to buy native and indigenous plants to the region? Uh,
Mhm.
did the availability drive the demand? What do you think was the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's maybe a bit of both. Um, so early on, I kind of had a mix of things. I had some things that were native stuff, and some stuff that was not. Um, but I found that the customers that got most excited about what I was selling were the people that were looking for the natives. And also, I found that that was the stuff that coincidentally was easiest for me to grow because it was adapted to my natural climate, my natural environment. So I didn't have to worry as much about lots of heating with fossil fuels and things like that in the greenhouse to get kind of the right temperatures. Because a lot of the I have a gets very cold here in upstate New York. And so a lot of what I like to grow and just the stuff that was cheapest for me to grow was stuff that was local to the region. Um, And I think it's just stuff that I like too, right? So it's kind of a combination of all of the above. I think some people came in looking for other things and then found the native species and said, "Oh, I like that. I'll try buying some of that." But then I think a lot of people came in and they were just like, "Wow, we really love native plants and we have a hard time finding them. Glad we found your store." And then they placed an order that way. So I guess it was a bit of all of the above. But
So I'll come back to the actual plants in a minute, but
yeah,
tell us a little bit about you're in Buffalo, right?
correct. Yep.
So people might know Buffalo as being um, a sort of ski town, isn't it? Like it's a base for people who want to go skiing in winter. It's not terribly um, it's not terribly rural, but it's not it's kind of a bit suburban in the summer, isn't it? Like it's
Yeah,
there's
so I would say so. Buffalo is so what we would call a Rust Belt city, in that it had at one point in time a manufacturing base that was based on the steel industry, and so in the like 50s and 60s, there was about 500,000 people that lived in the city of Buffalo proper. But then with the decline of U.S. steel manufacturing, the city's population declined, and so now we sit at about 250,000 people. So at about half of that. Um, and so, and then just due to other sort of events in U.S. history, right, in addition to sort of the declining population in the city as a whole, right, there was this sort of trend towards suburbanization in like the 70s and 80s, and sort of urban sprawl. So Buffalo is not so it is a city, but it's a smaller size city, and it's certainly not as densely packed as something like New York City, or San Francisco, something to that extent. And it does get quite cold here. We do get a lot of snow. We do have some ski slopes about an hour and a half outside of town, but the geography kind of right in the city of Buffalo is fairly flat. So while there are some people that do go skiing, there's like a little ski town about an hour and a half south of here or an hour south of here called Ellicottville. I wouldn't say that it's primarily what we're known for. So.
okay. I know Buffalo from watching, Christmas movies on over the years.
For sure.
But so Buffalo is not close enough to New York City to be like a dormitory town.
Yeah. We're actually closer to Toronto, right? So New York City,
Okay,
if I
right.
was driving by car, would be about 7 hours. Toronto, not accounting for border madness, right, might be about an hour, hour and a half. So
So there we go. To put that in an Australian context, it takes you as long to drive to New York City
mhm.
as it would for me to drive to perhaps Canberra or maybe even Adelaide. So New York is a big state.
Yeah.
So in an Australian context, that's a big journey.
Mhm.
Probably about 2.5 times what I used to do as a commute at some times. So, yeah, it it challenges that belief, I guess, that we have that so many places in America are closer to each other than the main centres
Yeah.
in Australia. So let's get back to to your
Sure.
to your shop, to your
Yep.
store. Are you running a shop front with a sort of backyard display area in a main street, or are you still at home?
Yeah, so still at home, and so I have about the nursery itself sits on about maybe a quarter acre total of production space, so relatively small in terms of nursery standards, and then have a small greenhouse, and so we'll sell a lot of things online. So we do so I start seeding now, right, in anticipation of a cold period, right, to kickstart to get the proper stratification requirements in for
Yeah.
germinating a lot of the native species. And those will ship out in May. And then we'll have other stuff that we put up into pot up into bigger pots, trees and shrubs, things like that. And some of that stuff I'll sell locally, just kind of in the yard, so to speak. But it's somewhat segmented, so it's yeah. So it's still kind of a backyard nursery, but my yard's about a half acre in size, and it's cut in half. Half of it's the nursery, half of it's my house. So.
Cool. So a quarter acre block is from an Australian context, that's about the standard housing block in the standard housing development. So So you're living on one and producing on another like
Yep.
in an Australian context. The block next door would become your home business. So I hadn't prepped you for this, Brian. So give us an idea of some of uh, the plants,
Mhm.
the groups of plants maybe that are the mainstays of the local environment
Mm.
in your patch of New York, and
Mhm.
if you can, pair them with the birds, insects, and animals that rely on them.
Yeah. So I can certainly talk about the birds and the insects, and I can talk about the plants. Don't often know which one goes right to which one. I
Yeah,
tend to focus on just sort of diversity, right, as a concept, right, and assume
yeah,
that if I
yeah,
get
yeah.
enough of the good native stuff, then enough of the other good stuff will come into play. Um, I think so. Yeah, so New York in general, right? So it's predominantly deciduous type stuff, right? With also some conifers. A lot of the stuff that I focus on is primarily kind of the herbaceous, sort of perennial flowers. So that's kind of what I'm most familiar with. Um,
Now let me stop you there because I want to ask you. People always go for the trees, right? They
mhm,
know the spruces and
yeah.
the alders and things. So in horticulture generally, like in ornamental horticulture generally, speaking as a trade, do all of those herbaceous plants and some of those understory plants that may not be too showy
Mhm.
and have individual ornamental value, do they get left out of the trade? Like, are you filling a gap that is just missing?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, I think. Yeah, I don't know. I don't really have the
Okay,
data
well
to support that one or the other. I just grow them because I like them, A, right?
yeah,
And B, my business is primarily e-commerce, right? And so if I can sell you a smaller plant that grows very quickly and comes back every year, that's sort of a better value proposition because A, I can sell it to you cheaper and I can ship it easier. And after the first year, it'll be huge anyway, and it'll just be in your yard. So whereas something like a tree, if I plant, say, an oak tree, which is a native species, which is like really, really great for birds and insects and all of the above, um, that's awesome. But trying to get a big tree with a bunch of potting soil in the mail is a bit of a tough proposition, or I have to do it bare root, right, and have to then deal with the complexities of that. So um, a lot of the decision to focus on the herbaceous stuff ultimately came down to sort of other economic considerations, in addition to sort of liking the pretty flowers and things. So
yeah. So let's go through some of those herbaceous plants, maybe some of the genera, and you
yeah,
can tell us what the critters are that rely on it.
yeah. So I guess so maybe I'll start thinking about like so seasonally, right? So we're kind of end of fall, maybe like starting to get into early winter here. And so one of the things I sell is a lot of the asters, which is a pretty big family of plants. I presume they're sort of all over the world. Um,
Asteraceae, the daisy family. So,
yep. Yeah. And so we have a variety around here called New England aster that I really like. It's kind of a bright purple, sometimes gets maybe like pinkish colors to it. That's really great for like nectar feeding insects, particularly in the fall, as they're sort of trying to go into a dormant period for winter. Right, they'll hammer those aster flowers like really heavily, bringing back nectar and pollen to sort of supply the hive, or for so they can make through the winter. Um, and then grow a lot of the Liatris family, and so they tend to have these kind of bright purple, showy flowers. Get about knee height usually, and those are particularly good for like monarch butterflies. I assume other species of butterflies as well, but out of all of the plants that I grow, the Liatris family, they are like every time I go out into the garden when they're in bloom, there's always one or two butterflies hanging out on those plants. Um, and then I'm trying to think what else I grow. So I grow a fair amount of uh, like Rudbeckia species. Um, Yeah.
So that's the coneflower is the
Yep.
common name over here.
Yep. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. The a fair amount of the cone flowers, and those are really great. I mean, both for the insect population as well, but also I find a lot of small finches and things of that like to eat the seeds directly,
Mm.
especially going into sort of the later parts of the year when there's less sort of forage available out in the environment.
Because
Uh,
when they seed, they have seeds like the dandelion, don't they? Um, rather than a big hard seed.
yeah, like they're not like certainly not like a sunflower seed or anything that big and
Yeah.
hard, right? But yeah, tend to be a little bit smaller. Yeah, a little bit easier. They kind of just pluck them out one by one and able to go at it. So
Yeah. Uh,
yeah.
do you have hellebores up there? The hellebores?
Hellebores, not really. I mean, we can grow them here, but they're not native to the region.
Okay. No, I didn't know if they were a an American native. Um, climbers, creepers. You've got you have Parthenocissus, don't you, as an indige up there?
Yeah, yeah, I believe that's right. I don't have much of the climbers and the creeping ones, but yeah, I know certainly. I'm forgetting the scientific name at the moment, but I think trumpet vine is one here, and then also
Oh yeah,
honeysuckle.
yep, yep.
Honeysuckle is a big native vine here as well.
So the standard Linicera.
Okay.
Yeah. Although it may be a different one because honeysuckle tends to be for any sweet smelling
That's true.
climber tends to get named a
Yeah.
honeysuckle. Um, ground. You mentioned lawns before. I want to talk
Mhm.
about lawns in just a minute. But how about ground covers? Have you got particular ground covers that are adapted to that? Well, cold cold winters.
Yeah. As far as ground covers go, so I think, I mean, I don't think clovers are native to North America, but certainly I do like a lot of clover species for ground cover. Like if I have to broadcast a big area, um, yeah, I'm trying to think of other sort of ground covers aren't my strong suit. But I think tip, and then we have some native grasses um, that grow here, like carex is a big native one. Which I think does provide some ornamental value and is fairly robust and hardy. Wouldn't be great for say like walking all over because it tends to be a little patchy and not
Yeah,
as
and
not as
it's
aggressive as
very
some,
it's
but yeah,
it's clumpy, isn't it? It's
yes,
yeah, yeah. So
yeah.
all right, I'd advertise this stream as talking about basic principles, and I wanted to
Mhm.
introduce where you were from and what you were
Yeah.
into now. Let's let's workshop a situation where
Sure.
somebody's just moved into your area and
Mhm.
maybe they have maybe they've come from the southwestern states, right? So
Mhm.
they're used to a very different climate and a very different suite of trees and shrubs and perennials and annuals that they
Mhm.
would use. And they come to you and they say, Brian,
Yeah.
I want to encourage all the birds around here and all of the insects. I see we've got lots
Mhm.
of butterflies. I'm assuming that you have monarchs,
Yep.
monarch butterflies coming through there. So, what do what do you tell them as a starting point? Where do
Mhm.
you take them first?
Yeah. So I guess I would think a couple of things. So um, I'd want to think about what kind of a space are they growing in, right? Not only like how much of an area are they looking to plant, but is it full sun? Is it sort of wet, soggy soil? Does it drain very well? And just thinking through a little bit about getting the right plants in the right space, and sort of, but assuming it's a fairly open kind of environment that at least gets sun half of the day, isn't and drains relatively well. It's usually not too much of a concern. But then I would think through planting preparation, right? And so if they have time to say lay down like a tarp or something to kill the grass, right, or whatever else may be laying underneath that, right, going through that. But maybe they already have some sort of space prepared, a bed area prepared. And so if they're already at the point of like, hey, I've got the bed prepared, I know how to do that, I already have some gardening knowledge, I just need to get the local adaptation part figured out. Then I would typically be thinking about a couple of things. So I'd be thinking about diversity, and I would be thinking about timeline of blooms, and I guess I would be thinking about like structure of the garden. And so I think when I say structure, right, thinking about like how are we defining the space, right? So maybe we have some native shrubs and things or trees on the border, and then in front of that we have the more sort of flowering, sort of herbaceous plants, right, and trying to define things kind of that way, because then we get sort of both the habitat benefit, right, from the shrubs and things behind, and then we can get possibly some of the food benefit from the herbaceous things, either directly through seed or secondarily through insect life that those plants are supporting. And then I would also just think about timeline, right? So a lot of the native plants that we have in the Northeast, their blooms can often be staggered, right? So I might grow lupin in the spring that comes out and is this big, beautiful sort of candle-looking flower. But after a month, it's gonna start going dormant and it's not gonna flower again until next year, right? So thinking about what am I going to plant in succession, maybe next to that lupin, so that after May is done, right? June comes, okay, the lupins are gone. What's coming up next after that, right? So then maybe that's where maybe some of the cone flowers start to come in, or maybe some of the bee balms or some of the other species. So I like to think about planting a diversity of things, both in sort of form, but also in terms of timeline, so that we can have sort of consecutive blooms throughout the year, B, so that we provide sort of better habitat and better feed value for everything that's going on. So those are some of the things I tend to think about. One of the nice things though with a lot of the native plants though is that it's hard to like mess up. Like you might not get the optimal situation, but because they're sort of from this region, they've co-evolved with all of the climatic conditions and pests and fungi and things like that. So they tend to be fairly hardy and robust. And as long as they get sort of a good initial period of care for a month or two and just making sure they're watered and being on top of weed management and things like that, after a certain point, they can kind of take on a life of their own and just do their own thing. So.
Now, I want to ask you about one bugbear of mine, and I'm wondering if it's common there in the States too. You talked about that that effect of bulking up a garden bed where you have sort of shelter at the back,
yep,
and shade, and I'm thinking that wind amelioration is probably something you really need to think about in winter there, and then in front having food plants that can also be decorative. They're the things that are providing flowers and whatnot. Are there really common mistakes that you see in typical household gardens there, where garden beds are just too narrow? They are not deep enough, so that people are planning for a path and a lawn, and they work out their spaces, and then the very last thing they think about is the garden bed. Is that common with garden design professional or amateur up there?
Yeah, I would say probably more on the professional side of things than on the amateur side of things. I think anyone that's trying to plant flowers is a friend in my book. I think the thing that bothers me the most is sort of I see this as sort of the parking lot style of horticulture, right?
Yeah.
I've laid down a bunch of landscape fabric and some rubber mulch and then some boxwoods to dot the landscape, and we call it a day, right? When I see that, I don't really like that. But also, working in urban spaces, right? Sometimes the dimensions can get weird and funky depending on where sidewalks are and where people are trying to plant things and stairways and things. So I wouldn't say I see so much people planting things too narrow, right? Or if they are, it's just they're trying to adapt to the space that they have. But I would say the more sort of commercial aspects of horticulture sometimes have some design principles that I don't quite like as much, right? But
Yeah, no, the purpose of heading in that direction is really to ask you is, has the idea of habitat gardening or gardens for wildlife become front of mind for lots of people, apart from just the homeowner, but also the trade? Has the trade moved to that? Like, are there uh, garden designers, landscape contractors, and big production nurseries who are featuring the idea of gardening for wildlife?
I see. Yeah. I mean, I think it's probably going to be hit and miss depending on circumstance. I think, I've certainly met people that run landscaping companies, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I would love to do more of the natives. I would love to do more of these different kinds of plants, but I just don't have the consumer demand for them." Right. Um, on the other
That's an
hand,
interesting one, isn't it?
yeah,
Because I used to work for a big box hardware store that has destroyed our gardening industry here, as
yeah,
far as I'm concerned. And that's what uh, the buyers used to say. Oh well, we don't have demand for those plants. I go, well, you're not offering them, so we can't run a sales report that
yeah,
says, how many Banksias did we sell compared to, how many Raphael lepus, because we don't have any Banksias. We've
yeah,
only got Raphael lepus
right.
in the hedging plant section. So how can we do a comparison?
Yeah,
Uh,
true. I think on the other hand, too, I think something that again, I think you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, right? As there tends to be a desire in sort of the larger companies, right, for things that streamline and industrialize very well, right? And a lot of the native plants, at least that I work with, right, they have somewhat complicated germination requirements, right? Because of that, like I have some plants that if I want to get them to germinate appropriately, I have to plant them 90 days before I would want them to start germinating because they have to go through that period of, either directly or replicating, right? That going through the winter, coming up into spring, right, and then germinating, right? So,
and
I,
that's that process of stratification that
yes,
we were
yeah,
talking about, where and people might know that this is necessary for tulip bulbs, that they need to chill down. Many of the European bulbs need to do this. So, are you replicating that in your home? Have you got a refrigerator or a freezer in the shed where you're stratifying to streamline your own production?
yeah. So I prefer to seed directly into the flats that I'm going to grow in, and I just do them well in advance. So I do know some growers, they'll take like a mix of vermiculite or maybe burlap or something and wrap the seeds in burlap and stick those in the refrigerator. And I have done that a little bit, but um, wet seeds are harder to work with, right? They're harder to spread around the trays and the flats. So what I do is I prefer to just stack them up in a somewhat sheltered area, either say in a greenhouse with shade cloth and temperature control to exhaust excess heat, or just in a covered shed outside, and then just checking the moisture content every so often during the winter to make sure they're not drying out, and doing it that way. So, and I just find that like seeding directly into the natural environment gets me the best results, because I do find that I think there are some species where they want a bit of variation, and they want not just cold moist, but they want cold moist that kind of gets a little warmer and then gets a little colder and gets a little warmer and a little colder. Whereas putting them straight in the refrigerator just gives them a constant temperature, which will work. But also there's the germination data and the like minimum temperature like constraints on growing native seedlings. I've tried to search the literature for
Doesn't
it.
exist,
It
does it?
doesn't exist. It's just
No.
not there. It's like an area of science that is just not well researched.
Well,
So,
that's because it's commercially driven. That research happens
right. Yeah.
when people are doing, mass scale production, and well, I'm guessing that's not where you and I
Yeah.
where you and I are. I mean, I'm producing dozens of each species rather than hundreds and thousands, because growing what I like and what people ask me to grow.
Yeah.
So let me come back to that point a bit about the industry not really being on top of or promoting this idea of gardening for wildlife.
Mhm.
I'm a bit surprised by that because we've got fairly vigorous campaigns that
Hmm.
have happened here over the last 15 or 20 years, and groups like BirdLife Australia have got behind them, and the nursery industry has got behind special labels where usually for nectar feeding birds, and also the idea of bee friendly
Mhm.
and butterfly friendly have been the most prominent. But there's lots of regional efforts where people are promoting food for koalas, which are koala habitat is rapidly disappearing. But when there's regional species that
Mhm.
are popular, like lyrebirds in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne, I know nurseries will be promoting plants that are conducive to helping build up wildlife habitat.
Hmm.
Have you got that kind of movement with any of the wildlife societies, the conservation societies, the
Yeah, I think if we think towards like more of the like plant societies and conservation societies, especially at the more regional level, like if I say the Western New York, such and such, right? Um, those certainly exist, and I think there are certainly proponents and advocates at that level, and kind of spread throughout. So,
something that's becoming uh, prominent here is the idea of having wildlife corridors and trying to get
yeah.
neighbours and municipalities to
Mhm.
cooperate so that areas of bushland or even waste ground can link up so that some natural recruitment can occur and to give you know uh, passageways for
Mhm.
small creatures to move around. Is that something that's gaining traction up there as well?
Um, I mean, I think I've certainly heard of the concept, but I don't think I could point you to any sort of high profile projects. Um, yeah, I think there's still in this country perhaps a bit too much of an obsession with, I guess, what I'd say tidiness, right? And sort of that fresh cut grass, so to speak, which is not my preference, but that's what it is. So I think,
How about sorry, Brian,
yeah, no,
we have that obsession towards
yeah.
tidiness as well. But the other thing that happens in a municipal context
Mhm.
is safety, whereas
Mhm.
all the undergrowth, all the underbrush, all the mid-level shrubs get removed from
Mhm.
parks, and so that you have trees and you have ground covers or maybe a few grasses, but that middle layer has been removed. Is that something that you're getting as well?
Yeah, I mean, I've had the city of Buffalo come onto private property and rip out my shrubs for no reason. So yeah, I think I've seen that.
That's that's crazy, isn't it? But well, here's another bugbear of mine. I wonder if it's a common thing too. Do you know if the city of Buffalo has a biodiversity policy?
No, we do
No.
not.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, we
yeah, no. If you're looking for progressive environmental government, Buffalo, New York is not the place to be. But
okay. That's interesting. We usually have biodiversity policies, but then uh, they are
we
just
might
not.
have something at like the state level for the state of New York through like the state Department of Environmental Conservation, right? But typically, you would have to be either I think a very large city or a very progressive city in the United States to have like a biodiversity policy at the local level.
I like the use of the word progressive in the
Mhm.
States. Like you say, a progressive city is one that actually wants to foster a healthy environment.
Yeah.
It's really weird that because progressive is used as a pejorative in that
Oh,
term.
interesting.
Uh, well, I hear I consume a lot of US
Yeah.
political media, and you never hear anyone say, Oh, they're a progressive when they want to compliment them.
Hmm.
When
Okay.
when people are talking about progressive cities,
Mhm.
that's supposed to be a pejorative term, isn't it?
Probably depends on the media source you're listening to. I think, yeah, but yeah.
Um, so, give me an idea of the kinds of insects. Well, you mentioned
Mhm.
monarch butterflies. Now they're an icon species, and there's
Yeah.
national and international moves afoot
Mhm.
to preserve them. Uh, I think people are aware of the plight
The butterfly.
uh,
Yeah.
of the butterflies. Now, I saw this morning on Blue Sky, I saw a report from the UK where in areas where they have been rewilding, which is basically letting areas just come back of
Yeah.
their own accord, the bumblebee populations in areas that have rewilded have increased by 261 times.
Wow.
So the question
Wow.
is, why are we still even having a debate about the value
Mhm.
of rewilding?
Yeah.
What are the other kinds of insects that people are
Yeah.
aware of and that are friendly, conducive to?
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. I can talk about the other insects. I'm not an entomology expert, but I can give my best shot. And I think after this, I gotta actually hop out. I gotta run to an appointment. But
Cool.
um, so I think there's a lot of native flies, right? So before we had the bees and the butterflies, flies were like the original pollinators, right? And so by adding in a lot of other native species, right, we do see other kinds of tiny little gnats and things come back. But also bees, like there is an incredible diversity of bees outside of the European honeybee. And so all sorts of tiny sweat bees and things like that that'll be buzzing around. But then also moths. So moths, bees, and then of course all of that brings in some spiders, right? And then all of that brings in more birds. So yeah, I mean it's really I think like going back to the oak tree for example. I think in some of the studies that I've read, a single oak tree can at times support 600 different species of insect at one point in time, right? Compared to say like an invasive species like a tree of heaven or something, Southeast Asia, right? When it's in this environment, it maybe supports 2 or 3
Yeah.
species of insect,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
yeah,
So there's no doubt that they're important. Well, Brian, I
yeah,
know because it's a holiday weekend, you've probably got something you have to do. So
yeah,
let's. Hopefully, we can talk again. Maybe
yeah.
we can be a little bit more specific. I'm really interested in how you deal with water in
Ah,
the garden in an area that freezes and
yep,
then has a summer. So maybe we can do that in a month or two,
for sure.
and do that. So just pop out any time you like, folks.
All right.
I'm going to run through a year of flowers. Thanks, Brian.
Take care.
Zuba
Super
plants.
plants. Yeah,
I'll link, and you can find Brian
appreciate it.
on Blue Sky.
Yeah. All right. Take care. Bye.
Cheers, mate. Um, so that was interesting. I've just bumped into Brian on Blue Sky, and I was really happy to have a short conversation with him. Um, it seems like we are not in such a parlous state here in parts of Australia. At least there is a movement towards preservation and biodiversity, even though from where I sit, it's never enough. But sounds like it. We're a lot further along making neighbourhoods more biodiverse and more wildlife friendly than perhaps they are in parts of northeast USA. Now, I'm happy to take some questions and comments. I'm interested in how people in New South Wales had dealt with the extreme heat in the last few days in their garden, and I'd be interested to know how people are planning to deal with the excessive water that is probably going to fall in from the sky in the next couple of days, or perhaps it's going to run down some watercourse to your place in the next couple of days. But in the meantime, I'm going to play our little slideshow that I prepared for a year of flowers, which I had talked about briefly. So we'll just pop through that, and I'll give a little bit of commentary. What I did was focus on Banksias, Melaleucas, and Eucalyptus / Corymbia. I didn't differentiate all the eucalypts whether they were Corymbias, just because it was going to mess up my slides. But also, if you're looking for these, any of these plants, you're probably going to have better luck if you're searching for eucalypts rather than Corymbias, unless it's Corymbia fusifolia, which I left out of this because pretty much everyone knows the red flowering or scarlet flowering gum. So let's have a look. We're going through for a year in January, and these are plants that flower in January, and I've tried to make each month a bit different. So that is the Eucalyptus macrocarpa is the photo, or the mottle car is the common name. A small but showy eucalypt, but you can also look for flowers for Eucalyptus forrestiana, rugosa, and berryana at this time of the year. For Banksias, that's Banksia baxteri, the bird's nest Banksia. You also can look for Banksia attenuata, Banksia audax, Banksia occidentalis, which is one of my particular favourites, Banksia pedialaris, which is a terrific ground cover, and Banksia spinulosa, which you will be able to find pretty much everywhere, I would say. Melaleucas for January, Calithamnoides, and that is the photo there. Really interesting. It does have foliage and a habit very much like the Calithamnus, but Calithamnus are a proteaceae plant. But there we are. That's an interesting flower. Melaleuca coccinea, Melaleuca elliptica, and Melaleuca fulgens. Now, fulgens is a beauty if you can find it and you can grow it successfully. February, eucalypts, Rhodantha. Rhodantha is quite similar to Macrocarpa, very showy, grey foliage. Oh, hang on, we've got a comment. Glenn's telling us about the heat. All good in Western Sydney with the heat. All plants looking good in the garden. The rain started yesterday, so far not too bad. Starting to get blue-banded bees in the garden now. So is that new, Glenn, getting your blue-banded bees in? That's really, really interesting. Are blue-banded bees one of the bees that will use a little bee hotel, or are they getting into the fissures in the bark, or are they looking for shelter in your rocks, your stones, Glenn? Satin bowerbirds are still building a bower in the yard. That's great. So the habitat garden is starting to show its value to the local wildlife. So that's great. So what are you into? This will be your third summer with most of the work done. Is that right, Glenn? To give an idea of how long it takes. Okay, while I'm waiting, if Glenn's going to comment again, Eucalyptus rhodantha, forrestiana, alpina, anceps, and polybractea, and that photo is the flowers of Eucalyptus polybractea. When I compiled these lists too, I tried to make them not too big. When I was talking about the eucalypts and the Banksias, that they were not too big, so they were a sensible choice for the majority of gardens out there. February Banksias, Baxteri, Canei, Conferta, Dryandroides, Integrifolia, and Verticillata. Now there's Banksia Dryandroides, which means leaves like a dryandra. Banksia Dryandroides is really good if you have a free draining and sunny spot in. Certainly I had them growing well in Gippsland and in Melbourne, so a favourite again. Melaleucas for February, Melaleuca argentea, Melaleuca decora, Melaleuca laterita, Melaleuca macronica, and Melaleuca pulchella. Argentea is quite a large Melaleuca with an upright form, so it's an interesting one. Laterita is quite commonly available out in the nursery, in native nurseries, and you'll find Melaleuca pulchella out there too, and that's a red flower. I've got a spreadsheet that I'm putting together for this with all the flowers and the flower colours and the heights, as well as putting them into the months. So we'll have that available for download probably next week. March, eucalyptus. Eucalyptus kitsoniana is that flower. Eucalyptus gumifera. Hemostoma, which is the scribbly gum in Canberra. Quite a big tree. Oh, I've made a mistake there, haven't I? I left an A off. Gomphocephala. Eucalyptus gomphocephala. Sorry about that, folks. And Eucalyptus forestiana. Forestiana is actually in flower now in some parts of my my suburban area. I've seen street trees, but they're it's mostly the buds that are showing now. But the flowers will open in February, March, April, but mostly in March. March Banksias, Banksia boweri, and that's the possum Banksia. And you can probably see why it might be called the possum Banksia there. Banksia birdetii, one of my favourites. Banksia canei, conferta, integrifolia, marginata, sphaerocarpa. That's a very interesting one if you want an unusual Banksia that holds its flowers downwards and they flower below the branch. And Banksia spinulosa. Good time for Banksias, for Banksia flowers, March. Melaleucas, not so many available. Melaleuca pulchella is that purple mauve flower there. Quite small, but very, very dainty. Really good in a rockery sort of situation, as well as in a mixed planting bed. Melaleuca laterita and Melaleuca Payne's hybrid. You will be able to find out there in the trade. April, Melaleucas, Saligna, Rupicola, Pulchella, Macrocarpa, Kitsonia, Obliqua, and Eucalyptus melliodora, which is the yellow gum. A big staple of parks and like watercourses and whatnot in Melbourne. Eucalyptus saligna, the Sydney blue gum, beautiful trunk. So you've got lots of flowering options for eucalypts in April. Banksias, one of the most reliable and very popular among honeyeaters. Banksia spinulosa is that photo. Verticillata, Sphaerocarpa, again, Banksia serrata, which of course is the big saw Banksia, the old man Banksia, and Banksia quercifolia, which is the oak leaf Banksia, can have mauve tinges in the flowers. One of my favourites, and reasonably easy to grow. Again, I had that growing well in Gippsland. April Melaleucas, Argentea, Pulchella, and Viridifolia. Now, Viridifolia is one of the large paper barks. You can see there the scarlet flowers. I haven't seen that growing well in Melbourne, but that's not to say that it wouldn't. That photo is taken in Sydney, I believe. Be worth a try. Be well worth a try to make the streetscapes a bit more varied, apart from the linariifolia, which is the snow in summer, which is very common in the streetscapes of Melbourne and I think Sydney as well. May, eucalyptus flowering in May. Now that's Eucalyptus diptera. Diptera is a small melly flower, and most of these are most of the mellies are small. But you will find Eucalyptus albans, calei, calophylla, closiana. That's an interesting one, hard to find, but worth searching out. And Cosmophila, all worth searching out. May's not too. There's not that many eucalypts that are bursting into flower in May, so these are valuable. Glenn tells us, not sure whether blue-banded bees are resting. They're feeding on the native raspberry flowers. Well, that's good. This is the second summer now. Well, there we go. I'd given you an extra year. The first of plants were only put in the autumn before, so most were small, now filling out and up. A few of the new trees are now over 2 metres and have now formed a good, thick, brushy area in the garden. Wattles, flowering gums and melaleuca have all joined together in foliage, so it's all taking shape. So the structural aspects of the garden are starting to come together, and the waratahs have doubled in height after this year's flowering. Waratah question for you, Glenn. Did you take the hedge clippers to the waratah, to the flowering waratah stems? What's your pruning regime for your waratahs? I'm sure Naomi would be interested to know that. Okay, May. Banksias in May. Lots of autumn and winter flowering Banksias. Bowerii, which we looked at before. This one in the photo is oblongifolia. It's a ripper. You don't see it in the trade that much, but it's really adaptable and it's really quite easy to manage. It loves being pruned. And where you prune it, at that point, it throws out a bunch of branches, and then the flower forms at that pruning point. And it's a term. So it's one of those plants that is great for hedging, for bulking up a garden bed. As you can see there, it's really well used against a paling fence. I love Banksia oblongifolia. But we also have Banksia candoliana, canei, ericifolia. Ericifolia is the backbone of so many of those hybrids and the cultivars that are out there, like honeypots and birthday candles. Integrifolia is the coast Banksia. Laricina is unusual but well worth looking for. And Banksia marginata, very common in eastern Australian bushland. Again, a mainstay, easy to cultivate, easy to look after, handles quite a bit of pruning, and is also likes being in cultivation. You'll see that perform in most gardens. May for melaleucas, Laterita. There we are. It's sometimes known as the robin redbreast, taking on that Anglo-centric way we talk about plants and flowers and gardens. Melaleuca leucodendron. If you can find it, it's well worth looking for. And Melaleuca quinquenervia is one of the paperbarks and a larger shrub or small tree. But I would encourage you to look for Laterita, Melaleuca laterita, or leucodendron if you can find it. June, coming into winter. That's the Eucalyptus cassia. Well, people tell me it's cesia, but I don't hear many people say cesia. So I'll go with cassia. One of the best. You'll see it marketed as Silver Princess in the nurseries. Calei is a beauty. Cephalocarpa. Burdettiana is a beautiful eucalypt. And Barriana, that's there in many of these recommendations. Glenn says, first year with keeping waratahs. In the past, they've died in previous garden attempts. So this year I've cut back one head and left the others to see which works best. Did you cut cut it right back to the the base? Was it basal pruning, or did you cut down to a terminal a node on the branch? I'm interested in your technique because there's many sages of advice for waratahs. I always think it's best to give it a go. I think they're pretty they're pretty hardy. They're more susceptible to root rot, I think, than being pruned improperly. So far, the ones I've left are doing much better than the one I cut. So we'll see how it goes in the coming month or so. Oh, that's interesting. Also, I'm wondering, did you plant? I can't remember, Glenn, whether you planted just a seeded variety of the Waratah, or did you go for one of the improved versions like Shady Lady or something? So let's move on to Banksias in June. Banksia hookeriana, commonly available. Terminal flowers, so good for cut flowers. If you're growing one, I would suggest grow two so that you can cut a lot of flowers to bring them inside. Obviously, it's a great plant for the honey eaters, but there's some really other interesting ones for this time of the year. Banksia ashbyi, Banksia amula, Banksia brownii, Banksia conferta. We talked about ericifolia before, and Banksia littoralis, all worth trying. I'm growing a stack of these too, by the way, so I'll let people know when they're available. You can, of course, get them in the Habitat Gardening Native Selection membership level, and I will send you 1 dozen is the standard membership perk. 1 dozen of selection from what I'm growing, but for November, and I think I'll keep it open till December, I'll send you 2 dozen. But you obviously don't get them until they're big enough to ship out. So they're only seeds. Some of them aren't even germinated yet. Some of the seeds are taking quite a significant amount of time to germinate. Anyway, next. Melaleucas in June. Not so many winter flowering Melaleucas, but there is this nice small heathland style Melaleuca, Melaleuca radula, or radula. I'll stick with radula. Laxiflora is also interesting, and Melaleuca densa. These will be difficult to find. I'll be growing these. These will be difficult to find in the trade unless you're in Western Australia, I'm going to guess. July, Eucalyptus kalei will be flowering. Burdettiana also. Eucalyptus citriodora is flowering. That's obviously, well, not obviously, you may not know. Melaleuca citriodora, Eucalyptus citriodora. It's actually Carimbia citriodora now, but let's just stick with the gum. That's the lemon-scented gum. That's a larger tree. Very decorative, but reliable. The lorikeets will be following that, so it's flowering in winter. Eucalyptus alpina is worth checking out. Eucalyptus burdettiana also. Eucalyptus dives is a small eucalypt, being used a bit for ornamental purposes and well worth seeking. You will find that in some nurseries. It's a bit more common in cultivation. Next slide, please. Winter flowering Banksias again. Banksia ashbyi, one of my favourites. Banksia amula, I also love. Banksia brownii, very good. Banksia paludosa. Quercifolia again, which I mentioned. Oakleaf Banksia, and of course the old man Banksia, Banksia serrata. Glenn's giving us some more pruning tips on the waratahs, the tilapias. Cut the head back to a node. 2 plants are Shady Ladies and one red, one white. Okay, so That's one of the cultivar varieties that you'll find for the Waratahs, the Shady Lady, red and white. Also, two separate ones from seed. Put them in slightly different locations. So, the one with the others is twice the size. Put one under the bottle brush trees. Okay, so a bit of cover as it grows up. So again, trying different things to see what works best. Happy to experiment a bit and see what works best in areas of the garden. That's the best approach to take in gardens. That's why generally if you go to a garden, a nursery, and you see something you like, buy two of them and put one in one spot and one in another and see how they go. You can always manage your plants. You can always move them or remove them, or if you decide you want to remove them, you can take cuttings and or collect some seed before you remove it. So you can put them into a more favourable spot. That's the beautiful thing about gardening. July, Melaleucas, Laxiflora, Leucadendron. Now, Leucadendron in this photos are paperbarks around a ornamental pond. So that's a good way to use any of the paperbarks, is mass planting. If you do mass plant them, they can usually be a bit smaller, but you get that that effect of a group of trunks rather than just one. Melaleuca radula or radula and Trichostachya. Now, Trichostachya looks great, but I haven't actually seen it in the trade, but it's one I'm going to get some seed of and grow. August Eucalyptus woodwardii. Now, woodwardii, I see that quite often in native gardens in my area, so it performs well in Melbourne. Rupicola Stewartii. Now, Stewartii I've only seen in botanic gardens, but it's a great eucalypt for this time of year. And Youngiana is quite common in the trade. It's advertised frequently, but if you're going to try one of this group, woodwardii, very reliable, attractive leaves, got that grey green look. You've got that silvery flower buds, and then the clumps of yellow flowers, and attractive to nectar feeding birds and insects alike. August, Banksias, Canii, Hookeriana, Spherocarpa, Spinulosa, Dryandroides, and Paludosa. Now, Paludosa is a bit larger, but really interesting plant. And there's Banksia Canii, has quite an open habit, greeny buds as the flowers are forming and then opening out to yellow. Has a habit very similar, I think, to Marginata, accepts pruning well. Quite an easy to manage plant. I like Banksia Canii. I would recommend if you need a small to medium shrub that's quite easy to manage, and you want a yellow flower, and you want it in late winter, go for a Banksia Canii. There's Melaleuca radula or radula again. Melaleuca steedmanii is bright red, an interesting one. Worth searching out if you can find it. Not that many Melaleucas are flowering at this time of the year, so a useful addition. Next, September eucalypts. Eucalyptus praesiana. Again, one of my favourites. Attractive buds, large flowers. It's a fairly small tree. It's almost shrub size. Pyriformis is also well worth looking at in Risdonii. Difficult to find, but worth the effort if you can find it. But Praesiana, that's usually available and you'll be rewarded. Eucalyptus Praesiana. Pyriformis is also a beauty. September Banksias. Attenuata. terminal flowers, very showy, quite large. There are some improved varieties out there. Big fan of it. There's a garden I go past on the bus that has attenuata in the front yard, Banksia attenuata. It's a ripper. Banksia audax is very interesting. Banksia bleshnifolia is a ground cover and also very reliable. I'll have to do a feature on ground cover Banksias. I think there's some rippers. But Banksia attenuata is a showy, worthy addition to any garden if you have the space. It is a large shrub when it is mature. September Melaleucas. Melaleuca laxiflora, I mentioned it a bit earlier on. There is the flower. A low spreading shrub, beg your pardon. Well worth the effort. Melaleuca incarna is a soft grey foliage and a small shrub, yellow flowers. Was in fashion many years ago, but it seems to have fallen out of fashion. Very reliable as long as it doesn't get wet feet. I would recommend Melaleuca incarna. It has small yellow bottle brushes. Well worth it. Melaleuca cardiophylla, decussata, interesting foliage, decussata, and helmatorum. I think I put an extra O in there. I think it's helmatorum, not tororum. I'll have to check that one. I think I was tired when I made that slide. All worth it. Spring flowering Melaleucas. October we move into, again, the height of spring, Eucalyptus platypus, Eucalyptus pachyphylla, Eucalyptus incrusata. I really like incrusata. And this one too, Eucalyptus grossa. Again, grey green foliage, yellow flowers, adds a point of interest. Here we are, Banksia ground cover, Banksia October. This is Banksia Gardneri. Has that russety bronze bud, upright leaves, divided leaves, or not divided. They're serrated, really, aren't they? Banksia coccinea, Banksia Baxteri, the bird's nest Banksia we looked at before, Banksia calei. Banksia coccinea is the scarlet Banksia that many of you will know. I think I've got a picture coming up later of the Banksia coccinea. But there we are. There's a great little ground cover, Banksia Gardneri. October Melaleucas. There's Melaleuca decussata, beautiful mauve bottle brushes. Bracteata, Banksia coccinea, Banksia acuminata, Banksia acerosa, all spring flowering, all rather small to medium shrubs. There's Eucalyptus forestiana. You can see that the buds, they're the buds, the red buds. Eucalyptus forestiana will behave in a couple of ways. If you prune it early and prune it down to its almost down to the roots, it will become a multi-stem bush, but it can be managed to become a tree, a single stem tree. Either way, you get these showy red buds as they develop, and then the little yellow flowers. The flowers are insignificant, but the birds and the insects still go for them. But you get these buds that they are persistent for a long time, and then you get really interesting seed pods. So Eucalyptus forestiana, worth a place in any garden. Eucalyptus conferminata, it's that bushy Yates style, little fingerlings on the flowers when they're in bud, and then they open up to be quite a furry looking flower head, yellowy green, really interesting. Eucalyptus sideroxylon is the ironbark. This time of year, it's flowering now around here. The honeyeaters and the lorikeets love it. Banksias, there we are. I told you there was a scarlet Banksia or a Banksia coccinea coming, and that's just to show that the little possums love it. Banksia attenuata, Banksia audax, and Banksia petiolaris. Banksia petiolaris is a ground cover. Banksia coccinea is worth trying and worth persevering with. If you have, I grew it in deep sand in Gippsland, and it was a really easy plant to grow. But it will perform in pots if you have heavier soil. It likes a lighter, free draining soil. November Melaleucas, Acuminata, Armillaris. That's Melaleuca armillaris is a big tree, but it's very reliable. Coccinea, Fulgens, Hypericifolia, all red flowers, and Glaberrima. Melaleuca coccinea, nice and worth a try. Eucalyptus perenniana for December, and Eucalyptus pauciflora for December. Not peak flowering time for eucalypts. The Eucalyptus cytoroxylons will persist through into December. I mean, they're flowering fine here. Oh, I don't want that one. Let's go back. Also, here, the Eucalyptus leucoxylon and Eucalyptus melliodora, surprisingly, are also flowering. We're only a day away from December. They're flowering here at my place. December Banksias. Banksia grandis. Now, that's a big tree. Banksia burdettii. Banksia dryandroides. Banksia levigata, subspecies levigata. That's this one. And Banksia marginata. Banksia levigata is just interesting because it's quite rare. The flowers are nestled. It's not a really spectacular looking plant, but I can tell you that the honey eaters love it, so it's worth a place in your garden if you can find it. And Melaleucas in December. Melaleuca hugellii. That's that one there. It's I think it's a West Australian. It's a rambling, spreading kind of shrub, but it does like being pruned. I would actually suggest it should be pruned regularly. Melaleuca lineariifolia, that's the snow in summer. That's a big paperbark. Melaleuca squarosa, more a smaller shrub, and timifolia, well worth a look too. I will have available these plants in more of a spreadsheet form with their more of their characteristics, the flower colour, any really significant cultivation tips that are needed, but just basically their size and flower colour and a little bit about their habit. If you are interested, that will be next week. It will. I think that'll be on the. Yeah, I'll let you know more about that. I'll let you know more about how to get it. I want to make it easy, but I also want to be. I'll see. Probably through the website first. Anyway, that's going to be it for me. Unless you got some questions or some comments, I'm happy to field any questions. I hope you caught Brian earlier on and enjoyed hearing from someone from the other side of the world and also the top end of the world, and a bit of an indication on how perhaps we're doing pretty well with our gardening for wildlife and encouraging native birds and animals and insects in our gardens. We've still got a long way to go, don't get me wrong on that, but I was a little bit encouraged hearing Brian talk about his experiences in Buffalo in New York. I have to remind you that tonight is when I speak with Biz Bell about securing seabird species and other species on offshore islands, pest eradication, invasive species eradication, monitoring the species that you're trying to protect. Biz is the managing director of Wildlife Management International, and we'll be speaking at 8 p.m. tonight on the Bird Emergency on Facebook, on YouTube, and on I've forgotten what it's called for the moment. Why am I forgetting the purple thing? Twitch. Why was I forgetting that? Anyway. So there we are, folks. I'll just stick around for a minute or two longer, see if you've got any questions or comments. Let me see. Thank you, Facebook and YouTube, for joining in. If you do want the Year of Flowers, I'm going to do this a number of times. I've just did the Banksias, the Melaleucas, and the Eucalypts. We'll do that with some of the more popular types of flowers, types of plants for native gardens, and I'll do a mixed one as well for those ones like the Floydias and the macadamias, where there's only one or two in the genus, so they can't fill out a year, but are worth considering in your garden. Also start doing some blogs about the planting, the growing on of the plants that I'm growing, to be able to distribute out to you folk, as well as growing on in pots for my little habitat garden project here at home, and also spreading around my neighbours so that we can maybe get many more Banksias and Melaleucas and perhaps some wax flowers and flannel flowers in the viewable from the streets around here. So there we are, 8 p.m. tonight. I hope you'll join me then to catch up with Biz Bell, talking about securing or saving species and monitoring seabirds on offshore islands. I'm really looking forward to that. We've rescheduled many times, so I'm really looking forward to having that conversation with Biz tonight. Actually, let me just do this live. I'll just check that I haven't got a notification. No, so I'm assuming we're still on. I'm Grant. I'm a horticulturist, which makes me a plant nerd. I'm also a bird nerd. I'll see you next time. Thanks for joining us on Habitat Gardening for the Bird Emergency. Hooroo.